Hi, National Chief Woodhouse. Welcome back to the program. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you for having us.
I know a big part of the discussions that are taking place here in Saskatoon today revolve around the federal government's pledge to expedite basically the review process, for projects that they deem to be in the national interest. I know you have written to the Prime Minister outlining how you think that process in its current form could contravene some rights for First Nations you represent. Can you explain tonight what your primary concern is right now about what the federal government is saying it wants to do?
Sure. Look, while we support efforts to protect Canada from geopolitical and economic uncertainty, First Nations are very concerned, though, that this federal proposal has the potential to violate many collective rights of First Nations, respecting our lands, our water resources, our inherent title and rights, and our jurisdiction and treaty. And First Nations will require clarification respecting the design of Crown First Nations engagement and consultation timelines, and how rights holders will be invited to respond to the Crown on this matter. The rights of First Nations under international law and the Canadian Constitution are at stake. If free, prior, and informed consent is not obtained from First Nations, this legislation will be marred and mirrored in conflict and protracted litigation. On a more positive note, however, the Assembly of First Nations response highlights the timely opening for substantive discussions regarding Canada's First Nations infrastructure gap. And this gap has perpetuated deep-rooted inequalities in Canada, in our beautiful country that we share. And it has led to poorer health outcomes, limited education opportunities for First Nation kids, and much less prosperity for First Nation compared to other Canadians. So if the national vision for the First Nations infrastructure is focused exclusively on accessing natural resources, First Nations and First Ministers need to rethink, and they need to broaden their perspective. And Canada, if we want to talk about fast tracking, let's fast track the basics like clean water, quality housing, modern schools for our children and our First Nation communities, all-season roads, and community infrastructure, basic things like access to high-speed internet. Many of our kids don't have that. And last week, we seen King Charles III read the speech from the throne and said governments need to honor truth and reconciliation in both word and deed. So in a country as rich as we are here in Canada, the shameful gap must be closed once and for all for First Nations people. And this is the mother of all Canadian infrastructure and reconciliation projects. Last week, the AFN also, we released with the Conference Board of Canada, we released a blueprint for investment that will close the First Nations infrastructure gap. And in addition to creating over $630 billion of economic growth and more than 330,000 jobs, closing this gap over the next 7 years will deliver dramatic socioeconomic improvements for Canadians, particularly as it relates to housing, education, clean water, and public health. So, we're thankful that we met last week in Ottawa with the Prime Minister. We discussed the First Nations infrastructure gap as a nation-building project alongside the concerns about the federal fast-track proposal.
I do want to pick up, National Chief, on the fast-tracking idea of it, right? Because we haven't seen the legislation. It's apparently being presented to the premiers or was today. Have you had conversations with people, either the Prime Minister or in and around the Prime Minister, where you have conveyed the concerns that you laid out this evening, and what is the response?
Well, absolutely. Look, I think that they need to do a better job in giving us small pieces of information. I think that that's wrong right off the bat. That should go out to First Nations immediately. If they're going to propose something, it shouldn't have, went to premiers first. It should have went to the First Peoples first and foremost. And if we're going to work on this relationship together in our country, make our country a better place for all Canadians, then let's start by fixing our relationship, because it seems like we're stepping 20 years back.
And when you hear, I guess, I wouldn't call it pushback, but I guess the argument that the federal government is making right now, and in particular this newly elected Prime Minister, is that it's a crisis. We need to get this stuff built faster in order to address the severity of their crisis. What would you say, National Chief, in response to that argument?
Well, then go and speak to First Nations. I just think, having draft proposed legislation, give the First Nations something to consider, show them right off the bat, not as an afterthought. And start talking about the hard issues right away and start closing the infrastructure gap across this country. Look, I think First Nations have been partners in this country since the beginning of time. We signed treaties in a good way. We're trying to, we've advanced a long way over the past decade. Let's not sabotage that by pushing First Nations people to the side. We weren't invited to the ministers and the premiers and the prime minister when they met today. Very disrespectful to First Nations people, but if they want to fast track through our lands and territories, we're going to have hard, frank discussions.
And what are you prepared to do? Final question, National Chief. I do know you have to catch a flight. What are you prepared to do if you don't feel that level of consultation or of respect is being provided?
Look, we meet with chiefs in assembly. We're meeting them within a month, in July actually, and 634 First Nations that AFN tries to dialogue with brings all of the leadership together, and I'm sure the chiefs will have a lot to say, and they'll be giving us a mandate on what to do next. So I think that the federal government and the provinces need to speak to First Nations directly around the table, open dialogue, soon as possible, not later. We're not a side conversation.
National Chief Woodhouse, I appreciate you making the time, and safe travels.
Thank you.